It was the winter of 1999, a frigid February or perhaps early March night in New Hampshire, when an experience so extraordinary occurred that it has remained vivid in my mind ever since. My three friends and I were driving back to my house around 10 p.m. after a long day. The biting cold seeped into every corner of the car, making it a struggle to stay warm. I was in the back seat, bundled up against the chill, while my friend, who I'll call Dave, was driving, and his girlfriend, Sarah, was in the passenger seat. Our other friend, Tom, sat next to me in the back. The winding route to my house was familiar, but on this particular night, something happened that none of us could have anticipated. As we were navigating the dark, deserted roads, Dave suddenly exclaimed, "What the hell is that?" His tone was a mix of confusion and alarm, instantly putting us all on high alert. Sarah, eyes wide, started repeating, "Oh my God, oh my God," over and over again. Tom and I craned our necks to see what they were looking at, and there, directly in front of the car, a bright light appeared. It seemed to dilate, growing larger and then shrinking back down. Dave slowed the car to a crawl, all of us now completely transfixed by the strange phenomenon. As we watched, more lights appeared in the sky above us. 4 or 5 more, each dilating and receding in a mesmerizing pattern. They grew to the size and brightness of police searchlights, but then became so small they seemed to disappear altogether. The entire car was filled with a stunned silence, broken only by our gasps of astonishment. We pulled over onto a shared driveway that offered a good view because it was on a snowy hill overlooking a reservoir. The reservoir was frozen solid, the ice thick enough to drive a truck on, which was a reassuring fact for any skeptics who might suggest we were seeing swamp gas or some other mundane explanation. The 4 of us got out of the car, the freezing air hitting us like a wall. We looked up, hoping to catch another glimpse of the lights. At first, we saw nothing but the clear, star-filled sky. Then, high above us, large, elongated lights shaped like lozenges appeared. There were about a dozen of them, just hanging in the air, moving slowly in various directions. These lights would occasionally get brighter and dimmer, as if they were communicating with each other. What really freaked us out were the smaller lights. They were about the size of bright stars and seemed to emerge from the sides of the larger lozenges. These smaller lights would appear in groups of 5 or 6 and then start moving quickly in erratic patterns, back and forth, side to side, changing direction instantaneously. It was unlike anything any of us had ever seen, almost as though the lights were dancing with each other in the night sky. We stood there, our breath visible in the cold air, watching this incredible display. The smaller lights would zoom around, sometimes squiggling erratically, before retreating back into the larger lozenges. Meanwhile, more small lights would emerge, creating a constant, busy display above us. It was mesmerizing and terrifying at the same time. The experience was so vivid, it felt like it was happening in slow motion, yet it probably only lasted a few minutes. Eventually, the cold became too much for us to bear. We climbed back into the car, shivering and in a state of disbelief. Dave dropped me off at the bottom of my half-mile-long driveway, not wanting to risk getting stuck on the ice. I watched as my friends drove away, then looked up at the sky one last time. The lights were gone. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the snow and the distant hum of the wind through the trees. A sudden wave of panic washed over me, an overwhelming sense of dread that I couldn't explain. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something was watching me from the darkness. I ran up the driveway, slipping on the ice but not daring to slow down. When I finally reached the house, I snuck into my room and buried myself under the covers, too shaken to sleep. For the next few days, the 4 of us were in awe of what we had seen. We talked about it constantly, trying to make sense of the experience. But we never told anyone else, not at school or to our other friends. It was as if we were afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed as crazy. Slowly, the conversations about that night faded, and we moved on with our lives. Years later, about 7 or 8 years after that night, I reconnected with Dave and Tom. Over a few beers, the topic of that night came up. I was almost afraid to ask if they remembered, worried that I had somehow made the whole thing up, that it was a dream or a product of my imagination. But both of them remembered the same details as vividly as I did. We were all a little embarrassed to talk about it, but the shared experience brought us back to that night, standing in the freezing cold, staring up at the sky in disbelief. Since then, I've often wondered what we saw that night. Was it a UFO? Some kind of military experiment? I've read countless accounts of UFO sightings and watched numerous documentaries, but nothing quite matches what we experienced. The lights, the way they moved, the sense of otherworldliness. It was all so surreal. Hey my friend, if you're into paranormal stories, the weird, and the unexplained, we'd love for you to join our expanding community. Hit the subscribe button and enable notifications to stay tuned for upcoming episodes. If you want to show some love for the channel, simply give us a like. Now, on to story 2. I've always been fascinated by the possibility of alien life, but the idea of visiting aliens or alien abductions was something I never took seriously. Sure, I enjoyed sci-fi movies and reading about UFO sightings, but it always seemed like a distant fantasy. That was until a bizarre encounter one morning changed my perspective forever. Trying to stay fit when the weather permits, I often walk to my office. It's about 3/4 of a mile away, and the walk gives me a chance to get some exercise and enjoy the stunning views of the North Pacific landscape. Usually, these walks are uneventful and quite relaxing, a perfect way to start my day. But this particular day was anything but ordinary. It was a crisp morning, and I decided to leave home early to get some quiet time at the office. I remember glancing at the clock as I headed out the door. It was exactly 6 a.m. The air was cool and refreshing, and the sky was just beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. As I walked up the hill in front of my office, I noticed 3 kids up ahead in the distance. They seemed to be playing with some sort of flying toy, which I initially thought was a drone or a kite. From a distance, it looked like they were having a good time, laughing and pointing at the object above them. As I got closer, I could see that the object they were playing with wasn't moving like any drone or kite I'd ever seen. It was completely still, hovering in the air. When I was about 100 feet away, everything went black. One moment, I was walking up the hill, and the next, I was on a cold, metallic bed. I remember thinking I must have fainted, and someone had taken me to the hospital. The room had a sterile smell, like a medical facility, and everything around me was incredibly clean and bright. My vision was blurry at first, and I had a hard time focusing on the figures moving around me. When my eyes finally adjusted, I saw a figure standing nearby with its back to me. It looked humanoid, but not quite human. The figure turned around, and I was hit with a wave of shock and disbelief. The being had large, almond-shaped eyes that were a vibrant purple color. Its head was larger than a human's, but not in the exaggerated way you see in movies. Its features were almost human, but with subtle differences that made it clear this was not a person. Panic set in, and I jumped up, grabbing a nearby tool to defend myself. The beings around me backed off, their eyes widening and pupils dilating rapidly, as if reacting to their own fear or excitement. One of them stepped forward, spreading its arms to protect the others. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted down the closest hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was narrow with doors on either side. I took the first door on my left, but as soon as I entered, I found myself right back where I started. It was as if the room had looped back on itself. I tried the second door with the same result. Frustration and fear overwhelmed me, and I collapsed to the floor, sobbing and desperate. In my panic, I noticed something strange about the floor. When I touched it, the metal seemed to become transparent for a few seconds, revealing that I was in the air, far above the ground. Hyperventilating, I struggled to calm myself and realized I needed to confront these beings if I ever wanted to get home. I stood up and walked back to where the beings were. One of them stepped forward, holding a rectangular device that looked like a crystal tablet with liquid colors swirling inside. It placed a hand on the device and gestured for me to do the same. Hesitantly, I mimicked its actions, and instantly, a flood of information filled my mind. We were communicating, not with words but with thoughts and images. I understood that they came from a planet on the brink of destruction. Their world had suffered environmental collapse, and they were searching the galaxy for solutions to save their home. They were particularly interested in Earth's oceans and wildlife, hoping to learn from our planet's ecosystems and technologies. The communication was brief but intense, and I felt as though we had shared an entire conversation in a matter of seconds. Afterward, they led me to another room where I saw a young girl, maybe in her early 20s, curled up on the floor, sobbing and muttering to herself. The sight of her broke my heart, and I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know how. The room had a glass wall with several cages built into it. Most of the cages were empty, but a few contained strange creatures. One had a small, furry animal with wings and an elephant-like trunk. Another held a regular earthly Labrador, and yet another contained a typical gray alien, either dead or unconscious. As I stood there, fighting the urge to pass out, the girl looked up at me with tear-streaked eyes. "This must be a dream," she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to tell her it wasn't, but before I could speak, the urge to sleep became overwhelming, and I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside, the morning sun just starting to rise. Above me, the same glowing orb I had seen earlier floated in the sky. It hovered for a moment before shooting straight up into the air and disappearing. I sat up, my mind reeling from the experience. I knew what had happened wasn't a dream. It was too vivid, too real. The beings, the communication, the strange creatures, it all happened. I felt a mix of fear and awe, grateful to be back on solid ground. In the days that followed, I tried hard to recall that experience. I considered telling someone, but I knew how it would sound. A medical doctor claiming to have been abducted by aliens? It would ruin my reputation and my practice. So I kept it to myself, sharing my story only with a few trusted friends. Even now, as I walk to work each day, I can't help but look up at the sky, wondering if I'll see that glowing orb again. The experience has left me with more questions than answers, but one thing is certain. We are not alone in the universe, and there is so much more out there than we can ever comprehend. Almost every night, I find myself walking my two dogs through the woods. It's always late, between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to come alive. There's something intoxicating about that eerie stillness, a thrill that keeps me coming back. It's like I'm addicted to the feeling of being spooked. I devour every scary story I can find, and although I'm armed on these walks, I know that if I ever encounter something truly otherworldly, a gun won't help. If I ever see a gray, one of those classic alien figures, it's probably all over. This story happened about 10 years ago, a night that has stayed with me ever since. Every Tuesday, my wife, our newborn daughter, and I would drive out to my in-laws for dinner. It was a tradition, a way for us to stay connected and catch up. They lived about 45 minutes away from our house, in a small suburb about 25 miles from the city. On this particular night, we were driving home on the main road, a route I knew like the back of my hand. The sky was clear, and the air was cool, a perfect night for a drive. As we cruised along, my wife and I were chatting quietly, trying not to disturb our sleeping daughter in the back seat. Suddenly, something caught my eye. Off in the distance, I saw two bright, glowing objects in the sky. They were a vivid mix of orange and yellow, almost like giant, floating orbs of fire. I pointed them out to my wife, who immediately focused on them too. She insists there was only one, but I swear there were two. They hung in the sky, glowing intensely, yet oddly they didn't hurt to look at. It was as if the sun had decided to make an unexpected appearance, but we both knew the sun doesn't set at 9:30 p.m. These orbs were mesmerizing. They hovered at roughly eye level, and we could see them clearly as we continued down the road. They seemed to follow us, maintaining a steady position in the sky. I was torn between wanting to get home and wanting to pull over to get a better look. The logical part of me knew I should focus on driving safely, but the part of me that craved these kinds of encounters was thrilled. As soon as we pulled into our driveway, I jumped out of the car and rushed into the house to grab my Sony camcorder. I fumbled with the case, my hands shaking with excitement and nerves. When I finally got back outside, the objects were gone. Disappointed but not ready to give up, I got back into the car and drove around the neighborhood for about 5 minutes, hoping to catch another glimpse. And then I saw them again. This time, they were much higher in the sky, almost at the altitude a plane would fly. I stopped the car, got out, and started filming. The orange orb moved slowly across the sky before it disappeared into nothingness. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I watched the footage I had captured, hoping it would be clear enough to share. I saved it to a memory card and later emailed it to a UFO enthusiast group, hoping for validation or at least some answers. The street where we saw the orbs is a main road in our area. There's a park there, and the objects had been floating over it. The park is surrounded by houses, and across the road from it are a Catholic school and a Catholic church. The juxtaposition of these serene, everyday places with the strange, glowing orbs made the experience even more surreal. That night, back at home, I couldn't shake the feeling of wonder and fear. What had we seen? I replayed the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it. My wife, still skeptical, went to bed, but I stayed up, reviewing the footage over and over again. The orange glow, the steady movement, the way they disappeared. None of it made sense, yet it was all right there on my camcorder. The following day, I shared the story with a few friends and colleagues. Most of them listened with polite interest, but I could tell they were skeptical. I didn't mind. I knew what I had seen, and the footage, though grainy, was proof enough for me. It was a weird, almost dreamlike experience, but it was real. About 15 years ago, not far from my hometown in rural New South Wales, I used to embark on a nighttime adventure that always felt like something out of a movie. Picture this. It's the dead of night, and I'm catching a bus from a small town called Millbrook, about an hour's drive from my folks' place, heading out to visit my then-boyfriend in another town hours away. The routine was grueling but exhilarating. The bus would leave Millbrook around 2 a.m., just when the stars were at their brightest, and return late at night. My dad, ever the supportive figure, would faithfully pick me up from the station upon my return, no matter how late. Now, the route between Millbrook and Cedarville, where my boyfriend lived, was nothing short of enchanting. A narrow country road snaked through vast farmlands, the occasional farmhouse bathed in moonlight casting eerie shadows across the fields. It was on this stretch, between two sleepy towns, that we encountered something that defied explanation. It was late one night, or rather, early one morning when the first encounter happened. The road stretched out ahead, flanked by fenced-off farms under a canopy of stars. Dad was at the wheel, and I was half dozing in the passenger seat when something caught our eye. A bright, luminous ball descending smoothly down a distant hill. At first, we brushed it off as headlights from a truck navigating an unseen path. But as we drew closer, we realized there was no road where this light was traveling. It wasn't a vehicle. It was a solitary orb, glowing with an otherworldly intensity. It moved so fluidly, defying gravity as it glided down the hillside. We exchanged bewildered glances, unsure of what we were witnessing. Weeks later, we found ourselves making the same late-night journey. This time, it was closer to midnight when the familiar glow appeared again, in the exact same spot. Dad, always the curious soul, decided to pull over. He cut the engine, plunging us into silence punctuated only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The light, as if sensing our attention, began to descend more rapidly, crossing the farm fields and effortlessly passing over the fence that separated them from the road. It hovered just a couple of meters off the ground, its size and luminosity now unmistakable. The orb seemed to pulse with an internal energy, its edges softly undulating like waves on a serene lake. I remember feeling a rush of fear and awe simultaneously. Dad, on the other hand, was transfixed, his eyes glued to this celestial anomaly. For a moment that felt like eternity, the light hung suspended in the air behind our car, about 50 meters away. Its presence was surreal, almost as if it was observing us as intently as we were observing it. "Start the car, Dad," I pleaded, my voice trembling with a mix of excitement and dread. His gaze remained fixed on the light for a few, more heart-stopping seconds before he finally turned the ignition. The engine roared back to life, breaking the spell cast by the mysterious visitor. As we sped away into the night, my mind raced with questions. What had we just witnessed? Was it some kind of natural phenomenon, or something more extraordinary? Dad and I exchanged few words on the drive home, both lost in our thoughts. Years passed before I stumbled upon stories of similar encounters. It was then that I first heard about the Min Min lights, eerie luminous phenomena reported in the Australian outback. The descriptions matched what Dad and I had seen that night perfectly, something beyond the realm of conventional explanation. To this day, whenever the topic arises, I find myself recounting that unforgettable night to Dad. Each detail, from the smooth descent to the pulsating glow, is etched vividly in our memories. It's a reassurance that we hadn't imagined it all, that what we witnessed was real and inexplicable. I often wonder if others have encountered similar inexplicable phenomena in the quiet corners of rural America. While stories abound from places like the Australian outback and the deserts of Nevada, I haven't heard many from the heartlands of New South Wales. It's a reminder that sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, and the mysteries of the universe are closer than we think. I was about 15 years old when the strangest, most inexplicable night of my life happened. It's a story I still think about often, one that has left me with more questions than answers. To be clear, I don't think I was abducted by aliens, but my friend Jay certainly does. Jay and I had this routine of sneaking out nearly every night. We'd slip out of our houses around midnight and stay out until 4 or 5 in the morning, always managing to get back before our parents woke up for work. It was a thrilling kind of freedom, those hours we stole for ourselves under the cover of darkness. One particular night, just like many others, we snuck out around midnight. By the time we made it to my backyard, it was about 1 a.m. We had this old trampoline set up out back, and it became our spot. We'd lay on it, staring up at the stars, talking about everything and nothing. It was our own little world, safe and removed from the prying eyes of adults. That night started like any other. We settled onto the trampoline, the cool night air wrapping around us as we gazed up at the vast expanse of the night sky. The stars were bright, the kind of brightness you only get out in the country, far away from the city lights. As we lay there, something happened that neither of us could have anticipated. Imagine you're in a room, looking around at the four corners where the ceiling meets the walls. You can see the defined edges, the sharp turns where the surfaces meet. The sky did that. It was as if the sky itself had transformed into a cube. One moment we were looking at the stars, and the next, it was as if the sky had become a giant, box-like structure. From the southeast corner of this cube of sky came a giant UFO. I mean, it was huge, taking up what seemed like a quarter of the entire sky. We both stared at it in dead silence. The UFO was massive, more enormous than anything I'd ever seen, and it moved without making a single sound. It hovered straight, spinning in place without moving like you'd expect a frisbee to. The edges of the UFO rotated, but its position remained steady. It was an eerie, almost mechanical movement that seemed impossible. Jay and I didn't say a word. We didn't even look at each other. Our eyes were glued to this massive object in the sky. It was as if we were communicating telepathically, a silent agreement to stay quiet and still. The UFO began to move towards us, and in perfect unison, we flipped over onto our stomachs, pressing ourselves flat against the trampoline. We stayed as silent and still as we could, trying to make ourselves invisible. Ducking from something sounds like a natural instinct, but this was different. It was almost as if we were having a mental conversation, both of us thinking the same thing. Stay flat, and it won't see us. Don't move. The UFO made a strange, angled S-shape across the sky. Although it felt like everything was happening in slow motion, it could have only been a few minutes. I think we both held our breath the entire time. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The moment it disappeared from our sight, the sky brightened, almost instantaneously. It was as if time had jumped. One moment, it was 1:15 a.m. The next, it was broad daylight. The sun was up, and it looked like it was around 7:30 or 8 a.m. We had just gotten to the yard, and I knew it was 1:15 because I had checked my watch. But now, hours had passed in what felt like mere minutes. I don't remember talking to Jay afterward. We just made eye contact, a silent understanding passing between us, and then we bolted for our homes. We ran as fast as we could, trying to get back before our parents noticed we were gone. A few weeks, maybe even months later, I was talking to my brother's girlfriend about what had happened. She was really into paranormal stuff, but also completely terrified by it. When I described the experience, especially the part where it felt like minutes had passed but it was suddenly hours later, she was convinced we had been abducted by aliens. She was serious about it too, not joking at all. I made a joke about going to hypnotherapy to unblock any memories, but she looked at me deadpan and said, "Don't. People who were abducted often get traumatized by what they remember. They can even develop PTSD." That statement hit me harder than I expected. Could there really be something hidden in my memory? Something too traumatic to remember? As time passed, I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or a shared hallucination. But the more I thought about it, the more the details didn't add up. The sky turning into a cube, the silent, massive UFO, and the time jump. It all seemed too real to dismiss. I've read about missing time and UFO encounters, but experiencing something like this firsthand is a different story. It leaves you questioning your own reality, wondering what else might be out there that we don't understand. Even now, years later, I can recall that night with vivid clarity. The memory hasn't faded, and the questions remain unanswered. I never imagined I'd be telling this story. Honestly, I've kept it to myself for so long because I figured no one would believe me. Even now, as I write it down, the memories feel like something out of a bizarre, twisted dream. But it happened, and it's time I share it. The whole ordeal began in the dead of winter. I was working up north on a long-term project, far from the comfort of home. Our crew had been put up in a motel about 10 minutes outside of the largest town in the area, a place called Fairview. It wasn't much, but I somehow lucked out and got upgraded to a room with a king-size bed and a couple of couches. It was a pretty nice setup considering the circumstances. Our workdays were grueling, often stretching from early morning until well past sundown. My room turned into a makeshift home base. I had my entire desktop computer with me, needed it for the project, but also for staying connected to the outside world. One night, about 2 weeks into the job, I found myself in the middle of a heated argument with my ex on Facebook Messenger. It was around 1 a.m., and things were getting intense. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on top of a pile of hoodies on the couch, completely disoriented. When I checked the time, it was 4 a.m. I rushed back to the computer, and there, on the screen, was a half-typed sentence from our argument. My ex had flooded me with messages, calls, and texts, demanding an answer. My phone was still beside the mouse, untouched. How did I end up on the couch? Why had I stopped mid-sentence? I chalked it up to exhaustion, convinced I must have passed out. But it didn't make sense why I'd end up on a pile of clothes instead of just collapsing back into bed. I went back to sleep, confused but too tired to dwell on it. A few days later, something even stranger happened. My routine had become pretty set. Finish work, head back to the motel around 9 p.m., shower, change, and drive into town for a late-night dinner at Boston Pizza, the only place open that late besides McDonald's. That night, I followed the same routine. I took a shower, changed, and headed for the door. But when I got to my car and turned it on, something felt wrong. Really wrong. I looked at the clock, and it was 2 a.m. For hours had disappeared between showering and getting into my car. My entire body felt off, almost violated, like I had been assaulted but had no memory of it. I was terrified. How could I lose 4 hours like that? If I had passed out, why wasn't I on the floor? The rest of the project went by without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. When I got back home, things seemed normal at first, but after about a month, the strange occurrences started again. I began waking up around 2 a.m. and couldn't fall back asleep until the sun came up. I'd have an uncontrollable urge to turn on every light in the apartment and stay up until daylight. My dreams were filled with random strangers urging me to wake up, and if I ignored them, they'd harass me until I did. One particularly vivid dream involved me driving to an upscale hotel. When I got to my room, someone started knocking on the door, shouting hello over and over. Just as I was about to open the door, the phone rang. A voice on the other end told me not to open the door. I kept arguing with the voice, but eventually, I hung up and opened the door. That's when I woke up, drenched in sweat. It was 3 a.m., and I couldn't go back to sleep. These dreams became a regular occurrence. Bright flashes of white light would fill my dreams, overpowering everything else. People in my dreams, always strangers, would run up to me and tell me to wake up, insisting the flash wasn't part of the dream. It was incredibly creepy, and these people were always strangers, never anyone I knew in real life. Before these dreams, I'd feel an overwhelming urge to go to sleep early. It was like a zombie-like drowsiness that I couldn't fight. I'd drop everything, sometimes leaving lights on or the TV running, and march straight to bed. but I'd always wake up after 2 a.m. and stay awake until sunrise. One summer, I took a trip to upstate New York with a friend. We stayed at a motel overnight before heading further on our journey. That night, I heard knocking on the door and someone shouting, "Hello," just like in that hotel dream. My friend was fast asleep, unfazed by the noise. I got up, unlocked the door, and nothing. I woke up sitting on my office chair by the desk at 6 a.m. The door was locked, nothing was taken, and there was no sign anyone had entered. My friend didn't hear anything during the night. He was angry that I had opened the door, but there was no evidence that anyone had come in. Still, it felt like another missing time event, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been awake when I answered the door. These events happened 2 to 3 times a week. I became afraid of going to sleep without the lights on and all the blinds closed. I even started staying up all night, only sleeping during the day. The weird sleep schedule was messing with my life, and I was getting fed up. I noticed that when I felt the urge to go to sleep, if I got in my car and drove to the busiest part of the city, the urge would go away. So every time I felt like I was being watched or felt the overwhelming drowsiness, I drive downtown, where there were lots of people. This seemed to help. After a few weeks of doing this, the strange urges, the dreams, the flashes of white light, and the people telling me to wake up all went away. I haven't had a single recurrence since. However, I still have a fear of going to sleep until the sun comes up. Pictures of typical gray aliens now scare the life out of me. Even the cartoon ones on shows like South Park give me panic attacks, something that never bothered me before. I still have no explanation for the missing time up north, the weird dreams, or that night at the motel in upstate New York. Most people I've told don't know what to make of it. My current girlfriend has noticed my obsession with making sure all blinds are closed, with no open slivers, no matter where I sleep. I once shared this story at a party, and a guy there told me his abduction story. He was convinced that I had been getting abducted, and that they'd either gotten bored of me or I had become a hassle by constantly driving to crowded places to avoid the happenings. Other friends have either offered no explanation or believed in some sort of abduction scenario. Who knows? I have no memory of physically being abducted, but the feelings of being watched, being urged to go to sleep, and feeling violated when waking up felt real and still bother me.